The heavy glass doors of the Seoul International Airport hissed open, and Baek Do-kyun stepped into the biting winter air. A year had passed since he had walked away from the throne of ash, yet as a sleek black sedan, one he didn't recognize, pulled to the curb, the old instinct to reach for a phantom weapon flared in his chest. The window rolled down to reveal not a hitman, but Nyamai, her face partially obscured by a dark scarf. "The shadow sector is being squeezed, Do-kyun," she said, her voice lacking its usual warmth. "Someone is using your old ghost accounts to buy up the neighborhood. They aren't just taking the land, they're hunting the woman who saved the dragon." The first thing Baek Do-kyun noticed upon landing was that the air in Seoul still tasted like iron and ambition. For 12 months, he had traded the sharp edges of a syndicate throne for the soft, worn-out life of a man who was simply there. He had learned the names of the street vendors in the shadow sector, he had learned the specific weight of a grocery bag instead of a firearm, he had learned that silence could be a sanctuary rather than a threat. But as he pushed through the terminal's glass doors, the silence felt different. It wasn't the peace he had cultivated, it was the heavy, pressurized quiet that precedes a landslide. A sleek black sedan pulled to the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the cold gray of a Seoul winter. Do-kyun's hand twitched toward his hip, an old reflex, a ghost of a weapon he hadn't carried in a year. The window slid down with a mechanical hum, revealing Nyamai. Her face, usually a map of warmth and steady resolve, was partially obscured by a dark scarf, her eyes narrowed with a sharp, familiar urgency. "The wind has changed, Do-kyun," she said, her voice cutting through the terminal's noise like a wire. "The shadow sector is being squeezed. Someone is using your old ghost accounts, the ones even you couldn't trace, to buy the neighborhood from under the people's feet." She paused, the engine of the car idling like a heartbeat. "They aren't just taking the land, and they aren't just after the money. They're hunting the woman who saved the dragon. And they're using your own shadow to do it." Do-kyun looked at the city skyline, where the glass towers of the elite pierced the low-hanging clouds. He had tried to bury the dragon in the dirt of the outskirts, but it seemed the beast had been resurrected in his absence, not as a man, but as a digital ghost. The sculptor was building a new empire using the ruins of Do-kyun's sins. He opened the door and slid into the passenger seat, the smell of ozone and wet asphalt clinging to his coat. The safe world was gone. The glass had shattered. "Drive," he said, and for the first time in a year, the dragon wasn't just breathing, he was waking up. The blue light of the monitor hummed, casting a sickly, artificial pallor over Do-kyun's face. Around them, the internet cafe was a cavern of mechanical clicks and the smell of stale energy drinks, a sanctuary for those who wished to remain unseen. But for Do-kyun, the screen was a mirror reflecting a ghost he thought he had buried. His fingers, once used to gripping the cold steel of a handgun or the fine silk of a boardroom tie, hovered over the keyboard. The ghost accounts, the secret, offshore reservoirs of wealth he had spent a decade filling, were active. Lines of code scrolled upward in a relentless, rhythmic pulse. It wasn't just a withdrawal, it was a harvest. "Look at the routing numbers," Nyamai whispered, her breath warm against his ear, though her voice was as cold as the winter air outside. She pointed to a series of encrypted transactions. Each one was a surgical strike, an aggressive acquisition of small, dilapidated plots of land centered entirely around the shadow sector. Do-kyun's heart tightened as he recognized the digital signature embedded in the metadata. It wasn't a name, but a geometric sequence, a hauntingly familiar pattern that mirrored the structural blueprint of his former estate. The symmetry was too perfect, the logic too cold. "The sculptor," he muttered, the name feeling like ash on his tongue. "He's not just stealing your money, Baek," Nyamai said, her eyes reflecting the scrolling ledger of lies. "He's stealing your philosophy. He's taking the dragon's wealth and using it to buy up the neighborhood, block by block. He's gentrifying the shadow sector, turning a community of people into a private fortress. He's building a cage, and he's using your own shadow to weld the bars shut." Do-kyun stared at the pattern on the screen. The sculptor was molding his past sins into a new, more efficient monster. For a year, Do-kyun had lived as a man, thinking he had shed the dragon's skin. But as he watched his own fortune bleed into the hands of a craftsman who viewed human lives as clay to be reshaped, he realized his redemption was a fragile thing. He had left the throne vacant, and someone far more patient had stepped into the dark to claim the crown. The ledger was a promise of war. Every transaction was a footprint leading back to the world he had abandoned. As the final line of code executed, the screen flickered and died, leaving them in a darkness that felt suddenly, terrifyingly, like home. The tires of the sedan crunched over broken glass as they rounded the corner into the heart of the shadow sector. The community center, once a beacon of peeling yellow paint and the sound of children's laughter, was now a construction of cold, black steel. It wasn't just closed, it was being erased. Militarized private security guards, dressed in featureless charcoal tactical gear, moved with the precision of a clockwork army. The air hissed with the violent, blinding sparks of welding torches as they fused heavy steel plates over the windows and doors. There were no eviction notices, no police presence, and no sirens, just the efficient, quiet thud of heavy boots and the scent of burning metal. The neighborhood residents stood on the opposite sidewalk, huddled together in a mass of silent, wide-eyed terror. Suddenly, a high-powered spotlight atop a black SUV swept the alleyway, its white beam cutting through the dark like a blade. "Don't look at the light," Nyamai hissed, her hand gripping Dukyun's sleeve with a strength born of survival. She didn't wait for him to process the sight of his sanctuary being gutted. She pulled him toward the shadows of a narrow crevice between two tenement buildings. With a practiced kick, she shoved aside a heavy, rusted trash bin, revealing the iron mouth of a manhole. She didn't hesitate, swinging her legs into the dark. Dukyun followed, the sounds of the sculptor's men fading as he lowered the heavy lid back into place, sealing them in a tomb of damp, recycled air. They descended into the labyrinthine service tunnels, a network of forgotten veins that ran beneath the city's concrete skin. The walls were slick with condensation, and the distant drip of water echoed like a slow, rhythmic pulse. To Dukyun, the tunnels felt like the city's intestines, dark, hidden, and filled with the waste of a civilization that refused to look down. As they waded through the ankle-deep runoff, the cold seeped into Dukyun's bones, more biting than the winter wind at the airport. He looked at his hands, realizing they were covered in the same grime he had spent a year trying to wash away. The safe world he had built, the ginger teas, the wool coats, the quiet walks, had been a fragile glass box, and the sculptor hadn't just cracked it, he had ground it into dust. In the suffocating dark of the tunnels, Dukyun realized that you cannot build a home on top of a grave and expect the ghosts to stay buried. He was no longer a resident, he was a rat in the pipes, and the hunt had truly begun. The stench of the slaughterhouse was a thick, metallic curtain that refused to part. Above ground, the saws screamed through bone. Below, in the hollowed-out concrete belly of the facility, the sounds were more visceral. The underground was a place where the city's civility went to die, a pit of raw earth and reinforced rebar where men were stripped of their titles and judged only by their capacity for violence. As Dukyun stepped into the flickering yellow light of the arena, the cacophony of bets and bloodlust died a sudden, unnatural death. The silence rippled outward from the center, a cold wave of recognition. He had discarded the silk suits, but as he shed his heavy wool coat, the ink on his skin spoke for him. The dragon on his neck seemed to writhe under the dim bulbs, its scales a permanent record of a legacy he had tried to outrun. He didn't wait for a formal introduction. A massive fighter, a man built like a wall of scarred granite, lunged forward. Dukyun didn't move with the grace of an athlete, he moved with the economy of a predator who had forgotten how to feel fear. Every strike he delivered was a release of the year's suppressed rage. He wasn't fighting for the thick envelope of cash sitting on the pit boss's table. He was fighting to reclaim the weight of his name, to prove that the dragon hadn't turned into a sheep. When the massive man finally collapsed into the dirt, gasping for air that wouldn't come, Dukyun didn't look at the crowd. He turned toward the shadows where the pit boss, a man with teeth like yellowed ivory and eyes that had seen 1,000 deaths, sat perched on a crate of rusted hooks. "You're a ghost, Beck," the boss rasped, spitting a dark stream of tobacco onto the concrete. But ghosts shouldn't haunt places where people are still trying to earn a living. Dukyun grabbed the man's collar, the blood on his knuckles staining the boss's shirt. "The sculptor. Tell me where he is before I decide to stop being a ghost and start being a memory." The boss laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "You're looking for a mirror, not a man. The sculptor isn't an outsider, Dukyun. He's one of your own. A council member who watched you walk away and decided the throne was too beautiful to leave empty. He's operating out of the server rooms in your old estate. He surrounded himself with your ghosts, using your own house to dismantle your world. He doesn't just want your chair, Beck. He thinks he's the new you, only better. More precise. Less human. Dukyun let go, the revelation sinking into his marrow. The call was coming from inside the house. The sculptor wasn't just a rival, he was a protege of his own shadow. The neon pulse of the city felt different now, less like a heartbeat and more like a searchlight. Every overhead camera, tucked into the eaves of convenience stores and perched atop rusted street lamps, was a glass eye belonging to the sculptor. Niamai could feel the weight of their gaze, a digital net tightening around her neck. They weren't just looking for a woman, they were mapping the geometry of her stride, the heat signature of her skin, and the specific rhythm of her breath. To the sculptor, she was a data point to be harvested. They have the sector under a digital dome, she whispered into the collar of her jacket. Dukyun watched her from the shadows of a recessed doorway, his face a mask of grim realization. He was a man of steel and ink, but in this new war of light and code, he was a giant in a room of lasers. Niamai reached into the hidden lining of her bag and pulled them out. The red rubber was familiar, a relic of her days as the invisible help, but these had been modified. The surface glinted with a dull, metallic sheen, a conductive polymer weave that turned her hands into something dangerous. She pulled them on with a sharp, echoing snap. The red glove protocol was no longer about cleaning up the dragon's messes, it was about erasing his trail. She found the first junction box behind a cluster of overflowing recycling bins. The metal housing was hot to the touch, humming with the power of 1,000 surveillance feeds. Niamai didn't use a screwdriver or a hack, she simply laid her gloved hands across the exposed copper terminals. A blue spark jumped from the polymer to the wiring, followed by a low-frequency hum that vibrated in her teeth. The gloves acted as a localized EMP, a surgical surge of electromagnetic energy that didn't just cut the power, it fried the optical sensors of every camera on the block. Above them, the red recording light of a high-definition dome camera flickered, groaned, and went dark. She moved with a fluid, predatory grace, a red-handed ghost in the machine. At the corner of the market, at the entrance to the subway, and beneath the eaves of the boarded-up community center, she touched the city's nerves. One by one, the sculptor's eyes went blind. The digital map of the shadow sector began to fray at the edges, the high-resolution feeds dissolving into static. For the first time since Dukyun had stepped off the plane, they were truly alone in the dark. The sculptor had the logic, the money, and the blueprints, but he had forgotten the one thing Niamai knew better than anyone: the most effective way to clean a house is to start by cutting the lights. The rain did not fall in the shadow sector, it drowned it. It was a cold, rhythmic drumming on corrugated tin, washing the city's grime into the gutters. In the narrow space between a shuttered dry cleaner and a wall of rusted shipping containers, the darkness moved. Dukyun smelled the copper of fresh blood before he saw the body. Slumped against a row of overflowing trash bags was a figure that had once carried the weight of the syndicate's future. Han Eol, the man who had nearly poisoned Dukyun to death in a play for the throne, was now a wreckage of human flesh. His bespoke suit was shredded, soaked through with a mixture of rainwater and a deep, pulsing crimson. Dukyun knelt, his shadow falling over the younger man's pale face. He didn't reach for a weapon. There was no need. Han Eol's breathing was a wet, rattling whistle, the sound of a lung struggling against the weight of a collapsed chest. "You look like hell, Beck," Han Eol rasped, a bloody grin splitting his lips. He coughed, a violent shudder that sent a spray of red onto the pavement. "Who did this?" Dukyun asked, his voice low and steady, though the rage beneath it was beginning to boil. Han Eol reached out, his fingers clutching Dukyun's wool sleeve with a desperate, dying strength. "The sculptor, he's not a ghost. He's the chairman. He's the one who taught us that mercy is a defect." He choked on a sob of pain. "He watched you walk away and called it a betrayal of the blood. He says the syndicate needs a king who isn't afraid to bleed the poor. A king who doesn't see people, only resources." Han Eol's eyes, once bright with a hunger for power, were now clouded with a terrible clarity. He's using your ghost accounts, Beck. Using your own sweat to fund a private army of mercenaries. He's turning the sector into a laboratory for a new kind of cruelty. He purged me because I couldn't go as far as he wanted. The realization was a physical blow. The chairman, the man who had mentored Dukyun, the architect of his original rise, was the one dismantling the world he had tried to save. It wasn't just a coup, it was a correction. Save what's left of us, Han Eol whispered, his grip finally slackening. His eyes drifted toward Nyamai, who stood at the alley's entrance, her red gloves glowing like embers in the rain. Save them from the men you used to be. As the life drained out of his former lieutenant, Dukyun stood up. The rain continued to fall, but he no longer felt the cold. The chairman had tried to sculpt a new monster, but in doing so, he had forgotten that a dragon doesn't need a throne to be dangerous. He only needs a reason to burn it all down. The old estate was a fortress of glass and hypocrisy, glowing like a diamond in the dark heart of the hills. Above, the Unity Gala was in full swing. The air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the clinking of crystal, the sounds of the city's elite celebrating a peace built on the bones of the shadow sector. Dukyun could hear the chairman's voice echoing through the floorboards, a smooth, honeyed barrette that spoke of order and progress while his hands were busy sculpting a massacre. But Dukyun and Nyamai weren't guests. They were moving through the house like a fever. They navigated the servant corridors, the narrow, unheated veins of the mansion that Dukyun had lived in for years but never truly seen. These were the paths of the invisible, the cramped spaces designed so that the help could move without disrupting the view of the masters. Nyamai moved with a disturbing familiarity, her hand trailing along the damp concrete walls, leading him toward the belly of the beast. 2 floors down, she whispered, her voice barely a vibration. The server room is right beneath the wine cellar. He thinks he's safe because he's surrounded by 100 witnesses upstairs. They reached the heavy, reinforced door of the mainframe room. The air here was hummed with the electric thrum of 1,000 cooling fans, a stark contrast to the orchestral music drifting from the ballroom. Nyamai didn't hesitate. She stepped to the primary terminal, her red gloves snapping against the keys with the rhythm of a firing squad. "I'm not just crashing his system, Beck," she muttered, her eyes reflecting the rapid-fire scroll of data. "A crash can be fixed. A blackout can be explained away. I'm planting a truth virus, a mirror script." She explained that the virus wouldn't destroy the files. Instead, it was designed to hook into every hidden, corrupt transaction within the Sculptor's ledger and broadcast them. The moment the trigger was pulled, every bank transfer to mercenaries, every bribe to city officials, and every illegal land grab would be mirrored in real time to the public internet, news outlets, and the cell phones of every resident in the sector. "He wants to be the architect of a new world," Nyamai said, her fingers dancing over the final lines of code. "Let's see how his fortress holds up when the world can see the rot in the foundation." She hit the final key, and the terminal blinked once, a silent green confirmation pulsing in the dark. The trap was set. The dragon's shadow was no longer a tool of oppression, it was a ticking clock. The hum of the servers was suddenly drowned by the sharp, metallic click of a dozen safety catches being disengaged. The basement, once a sanctuary of cold logic and shadows, was flooded with a blinding, clinical white light. From the perimeter of the server racks, men in tactical gear stepped forward, their muzzles leveled at Dukyun's chest. "You always did have a flair for the dramatic, Dukyun," a voice drifted from the doorway. The chairman, the sculptor of this nightmare, stepped into the light. He wasn't the aging mentor Dukyun remembered, he was a man revitalized by the thrill of his own cruelty. In his grip was Nyamai. He held her with a casual, terrifying ease, his arm hooked around her throat, the barrel of a sleek, silver handgun pressed firmly against her temple. Nyamai didn't struggle. Her red gloves were stark against the dark fabric of her hoodie, a silent testament to the work she had already finished. "The world is a hierarchy, my boy," the chairman sneered, his eyes scanning Dukyun with a mixture of pity and contempt. "It is built on the backs of those who serve, by those who have the stomach to lead. You tried to abdicate, to pretend you were one of them, but you are a predator wearing a sheep's wool. It's a pathetic costume." He pressed the gun harder against Nyamai's skin, forcing her head back. "Here is the final lesson. Take your seat at my right hand. Reclaim the crown you threw in the gutter, and help me mold the city into something eternal. Do this, and the woman lives. Or, you can choose to stay human, stay weak, and die in the dirt with her. Dukyun's world narrowed to the point of a single barrel. His heart hammered a rhythm of old, violent instincts, the dragon within him roaring to tear the room apart. He looked at Niamai. He expected to see fear, a plea for his life, or the desperation of a victim. Instead, her eyes were two dark pools of iron. She was silent, her gaze locked onto his with a terrifying, lucid gravity. There was no terror in her expression, only a command. She was telling him not to break. She was telling him that the truth they had planted in the servers was worth more than the breath in her lungs. To save her by returning to the throne would be to kill the men she had worked so hard to save. Choose, Dukyun, the chairman whispered, his finger tightening on the trigger. The king or the ghost? Which one are you? The silence in the server room was a vacuum, waiting to be filled by a gunshot or a surrender. Dukyun looked at the chairman, then back at Niamai, whose steady gaze remained an anchor in the rising tide of his own fury. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't beg. Instead, he drew a deep, rattling breath and let out a whistle, not a call of a predator, but a piercing, low-frequency signal that vibrated through the steel ventilation shafts of the mansion. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, the foundation of the estate seemed to groan. The heavy service doors, built to keep the help out of sight, didn't just open, they were overwhelmed. They burst inward with a thunderous crash of metal on concrete. But the figures flooding the basement weren't the black-clad mercenaries of the syndicate. They were the people of the shadow sector. The street vendor whose stall Dukyun had protected, the janitors who had walked the same corridors as Niamai, the cooks, the laborers, and the nobodies who had been watched and categorized by the sculptor's glass eyes. They poured in like a tidal wave, clad in aprons and worn-out work jackets, carrying nothing more than the tools of their trades and the sheer, staggering weight of their presence. The chairman's guards, trained for tactical warfare and surgical strikes, faltered. They raised their rifles, but their fingers froze on the triggers. In the age of the sculptor, every one of them was aware of the blinking red lights on the high-definition cameras overhead, cameras Niamai had subtly rerouted to a live public feed. To fire now was not an act of war, it was a televised massacre of the very citizens the chairman claimed to be protecting. Look at them, Dukyun's voice rumbled, stepping forward as the crowd pressed in, their faces a wall of silent, righteous defiance. You spent your life looking over them, chairman. You thought they were the clay. You forgot they are the mountain. In that flicker of hesitation, as the chairman's eyes darted toward the cameras and back to the surging crowd, the power dynamic shifted. The sculptor's grip on Niamai loosened just a fraction of an inch, a microscopic error in a world he thought he had perfected. It was the only opening the dragon needed. Dukyun lunged. He didn't move with the cold precision of the men he used to be, he moved with the raw, unchecked momentum of the men he had become. He bypassed the muzzles of the rifles, his focus narrowed entirely on the hand holding the silver gun to Niamai's head. The air seemed to crack as he closed the distance, the roar of the invisible army behind him drowning out the hum of the servers. The hierarchy was falling, and the dragon was finally home. The collision was absolute. Dukyun's shoulder slammed into the chairman's chest, the impact sounding like a hammer striking an anvil. The silver handgun skittered across the floor, forgotten, as the sculptor was driven back into the very machinery he had used to enslave the sector. The server racks groaned, metal screaming under the force, as Dukyun pinned the older man by the throat. The chairman's face turned a bruised shade of violet, his eyes bulging with a mixture of shock and a lingering, arrogant disbelief. For a second, the dragon surged. Dukyun's fingers tightened, his knuckles white, the ink on his neck pulsing with the rhythm of a killer. It would be so easy, a single, sharp twist to end the men who had turned his redemption into a weapon. The crowd behind them held its breath, 1,000 eyes waiting for the blood to spill, for the old king to reclaim his crown through the only language the syndicate understood. But Dukyun looked at Niamai. She stood amidst the people, her red glove stained with the dust of the struggle, her expression unreadable but her presence a steady, moral anchor. If he killed the chairman here, he wouldn't be saving the sector, he would simply be taking his place at the head of the hierarchy. He would be the monster the chairman wanted him to be. "I am not you," Dukyun rasped, his voice a low vibration that seemed to shake the very foundations of the room. He didn't snap the man's neck. Instead, he reached out with his free hand and slammed his palm onto the primary terminal's enter key. The server room erupted. 1,000 cooling fans shrieked as the truth virus Nyamai had planted tore through the encrypted firewalls. Upstairs, in the glittering ballroom of the gala, the orchestral music died as every giant LED screen flickered from a portrait of the chairman to a scrolling, neon-white ledger of death. Across Seoul, from the luxury high-rises to the cramped tenements of the shadow sector, every smartphone buzzed with an emergency alert that couldn't be silenced. The sculptor's life's work, the bribes, the mercenary payrolls, the secret land titles, and the recorded orders for the silent evictions, poured into the public consciousness. It was a total, irreversible bankruptcy of trust. The chairman watched, his eyes wide as his reflection on the monitor was drowned out by the evidence of his own rot. The soldiers in the room lowered their weapons, their loyalty dissolving as they realized their employers' bank accounts were being frozen in real time by international authorities triggered by the leak. Dukyun let go. The chairman slumped to the floor, not a king or a sculptor, but a small, broken man surrounded by the ghosts he thought he had mastered. The dragon was gone. In his place stood a man who had finally broken the cycle, realizing that the greatest strike wasn't a closed fist, but an open truth. The collision was absolute. Dukyun's shoulder slammed into the chairman's chest, the impact sounding like a hammer striking an anvil. The silver handgun skittered across the floor, forgotten, as the sculptor was driven back into the very machinery he had used to enslave the sector. The server racks groaned, metal screaming under the force, as Dukyun pinned the older man by the throat. The chairman's face turned a bruised shade of violet, his eyes bulging with a mixture of shock and a lingering, arrogant disbelief. For a second, the dragon surged. Dukyun's fingers tightened, his knuckles white, the ink on his neck pulsing with the rhythm of a killer. It would be so easy, a single, sharp twist to end the man who had turned his redemption into a weapon. The crowd behind them held its breath, 1,000 eyes waiting for the blood to spill, for the old king to reclaim his crown through the only language the syndicate understood. But Dukyun looked at Nyamai. She stood amidst the people, her red glove stained with the dust of the struggle, her expression unreadable but her presence a steady, moral anchor. If he killed the chairman here, he wouldn't be saving the sector, he would simply be taking his place at the head of the hierarchy. He would be the monster the chairman wanted him to be. "I am not you," Dukyun rasped, his voice a low vibration that seemed to shake the very foundations of the room. He didn't snap the man's neck. Instead, he reached out with his free hand and slammed his palm onto the primary terminal's enter key. The server room erupted. 1,000 cooling fans shrieked as the truth virus Nyamai had planted tore through the encrypted firewalls. Upstairs, in the glittering ballroom of the gala, the orchestral music died as every giant LED screen flickered from a portrait of the chairman to a scrolling, neon-white ledger of death. Across Seoul, from the luxury high-rises to the cramped tenements of the shadow sector, every smartphone buzzed with an emergency alert that couldn't be silenced. The sculptor's life's work, the bribes, the mercenary payrolls, the secret land titles, and the recorded orders for the silent evictions, poured into the public consciousness. It was a total, irreversible bankruptcy of trust. The chairman watched, his eyes wide as his reflection on the monitor was drowned out by the evidence of his own rot. The soldiers in the room lowered their weapons, their loyalty dissolving as they realized their employers' bank accounts were being frozen in real time by international authorities triggered by the leak. Dukyun let go. The chairman slumped to the floor, not a king or a sculptor, but a small, broken man surrounded by the ghosts he thought he had mastered. The dragon was gone. In his place stood a man who had finally broken the cycle, realizing that the greatest strike wasn't a closed fist, but an open truth.